just a bunch of typical things that one hears about a self. Someone can lose themselves in their work or in prayer or in some sort of experience. We say we do things ourselves. We have this sense that we're agents. We worry about our past, the past of ourselves. So what is this self that we're talking about when we say things like this? Or how do we understand this when we read things like this? So I want to go back to one figure in history, and we'll go back farther later on in the talk, but everyone makes fun of Descartes for saying, "I think, therefore I am," and so declaring himself to be a self. But he also said something else that's very interesting. He based his philosophy on his claim to be certain about a particular kind of experience that he called a clear and distinct idea, but what we currently would call an intuition. So Descartes not only assigned a noun to selfhood, he gave us the reason for assigning nouns to selfhood. And the reason is intuition. These are intuitions that are very deep, and we trust them. And we especially trust our intuitions about knowledge, and our intuitions of existence, and our intuitions that we are individuals. So I want to look at these intuitions, and I want to look at them mainly through the lens of neuroscience. But I do want to acknowledge that not everyone has these intuitions. Here's one of my favorite examples, Buckminster Fuller's declaration that he isn't a noun, he's a verb. And if you remember this little book, it's a delightful kind of Dada montage of a book. So I paired him here with Max Ernst. And what was the point of the Dada movement? The point of Dada was to challenge our intuitions and to challenge everything we think we know through aesthetic means, through theater, through artwork, music, etc. And we all know what happened to it. It morphed into something much more commercial, the Surrealist movement, and was then swallowed up into the middle of the 20th century. But for a few years there was a huge challenge to our whole way of thinking that was Dada. And I think it's always useful to go back to Dada as when we start to feel like we understand the world, and Dada will remind us that we don't. So here's my one slide sort of summary of the history of Western philosophy is as a debate about whether we should trust our intuitions about existence and our intuitions about knowledge. And you can go all the way back to the pre-Socratics, and you have people like Pythagoras, and then Plato, who was in that same tradition of trusting intuitions. Descartes, obviously, in the early modern period, took this ancient idea and rephrased it in terms of ideas, clear and distinct ideas, and launched kind of the modern movement. Modern movement in philosophy and the modern movement in science were happening at the same time. Then in the 20th century, we have people like G.E. Moore, who wrote a famous book on certainty, sort of defending the idea of certainty against people like Wittgenstein, for example. And the job of science was seen as certifying these intuitions empirically. Now, of course, the other side, the other tradition that at least goes back to Heraclitus in the West, but is represented by people like David Hume and Willard von Ormenquine in the 20th century, is to say, no, I mean, these intuitions are just intuitions, they're just experiences. There's no point in trusting them. They're probably wrong. And if you follow this path, you end up in a very dangerous, crazy place where you don't have any certainty, you don't have any ontology. It's extremely uncomfortable because every place you look, you see contradictions and paradoxes. So the job of science, as it was developed in the 17th and 18th and into the 19th century, was to free us from this kind of skeptical outcome where Our ability to trust our intuitions was called into doubt. And we all know what happened, right? What happened is science told us we were on the other side. Science told us everything we thought was clear and solid is actually wrong. And the example everyone knows about is quantum theory. But I should point out that I think that this is actually the greatest gift of science to humanity. I mean, technology is nice, but what science really has given us over the last 400 years is an awareness of how wrong we are. And that's just of incalculable value. So we know that quantum theory says this, that quantum theory says our worldview is drastically screwed up. So here's a one-sentence summary of quantum theory. This is just the Schrödinger equation applied to the state of the universe as a whole. It's called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, and it's one of the central equations of cosmology. And basically what it says is that the operator that represents the universe's interaction with itself doesn't do anything. If it operates on the universe's state, nothing happens. So you can render it in English as nothing is happening. And if you look at the universe from any perspective inside the universe, then it looks like all kinds of stuff is going on. But if you try to represent the universe as a whole, then nothing is going on. And we heard a couple of versions of that this morning, right? We heard about this infinite plane of possibility where, in fact, nothing has happened. Nothing is happening. And we heard about resting in this space of complete kind of non-manifestation. Well, quantum theory tells us this is what the universe is. It's non-manifesting. Nothing is happening, except from some perspective, like ours. But I want to talk mainly about psychology, and I want to start and kind of whet your appetite with experiences that are very commonly seen in people who have a particular kind of epileptic seizure in their anterior insular cortex. So what it feels like to them, and there are now many, many patient reports that are along these lines, and I've quoted a couple of sources at the bottom. What these people experience is they're just going about their daily life and spontaneously, for no reason in the world, not because they've done anything, they just stop. And they suddenly feel great. And they feel completely at one with the universe. All the boundaries around them disappear, and they feel absolutely certain that their experience is real. Now, the people around them see them having a seizure, and they call the doctor. And when they get into the clinic and people look at what happened, then it was a seizure that started very near the anterior insula, which is an organizing center for the whole rest of the brain. And they have this kind of very typical, stereotypical experience. So this suggests that, in fact, anything at all that you do, anything that happens to you that induces a fairly stable long-term period of coherent activity in the anterior insula is going to give you this kind of ecstatic experience. So that should give you pause about what your feelings of certainty mean, because this is one of the places they come from. The insula is the part of the brain that puts your experience together and gives it an emotional valence and an epistemic valence, even more importantly. So with this in mind, let's talk a little bit about memory, because our self-knowledge is so based on memory. And we've learned a lot about memory in the last 20 years. Here's one of the things we've learned, that every time you remember something, you change it. The way you remember it depends on how and where and the context in which you're remembering it. And then when you store it again, it saves some of that contextual information, so you've altered the memory. And every time you remember it, this happens. So sooner or later, your memory's built up all of this stuff that wasn't originally there. So your memory is nothing like what we think of as a memory in a book or in a computer. It's a living thing that's constantly modified every time you access it. And we've also learned that there's a feeling associated with memory. And if the feeling's not there, then you don't know that your experience is a memory. You can't tell that it's something that happened in the past. So we have to have this marker, and this marker can fail. So I have a quick survey for you. One, how many of you have vivid episodic memories where you relive episodes in your past? Just raise your hands. It looks like about a third. How many of you remember your past as if it were written in a book? It's about the same number. Okay? So how many of you occasionally have a real difficulty knowing whether something that you remember happened in real life or in a dream? I'd say about a third again to a quarter. So this is just a lesson in how different our minds are. Anytime you assume that other people's experiences are more or less like yours, you're probably wrong, because our experiences are really radically different. But what does this mean for memory? Well, what does it mean for us, ourselves, that we construct through memory, the character in our memories? Well, one thing it means is that our memories build up confabulation over time. And at a certain moment, a lot of what we remember as our past is actually a confabulated past. And this has been tested by recording what people are doing and then checking it against their memories sometime later, and confabulation just builds up and builds up and builds up, and pretty soon they have no idea what they actually did. It also means that it's absurdly easy to manipulate memory. You can make people remember they did all sorts of things that they didn't do, or saw all sorts of things they didn't see. And this is a problem, obviously, for the legal system and for therapy and for lots of other things. Now, why is this the case? Why is our memory so fragile in this way? And I'll just talk briefly about some of my work, which is focused on object identification. If you think about what's going on when you see someone, for example, today, and you say, oh, I saw that person yesterday. Well, when you saw them yesterday, you took some visual input and some other sensory input, and you combined it by some process that's probably Bayesian inference with a bunch of expectations, expectations about what people are and expectations about what people at this meeting are and other kind of general information about the world. And you constructed what's called an object token, which is a representation of that particular person at that particular time, wearing those particular clothes and saying those particular things. And then you embedded that object token in an episodic memory of this context in which you encountered this person. So today you run into the person again, and you do the same thing. And then you're faced with a problem. You say, okay, I built this object token. Is it the same? Does it represent the same object that I've ever seen before, or is it completely new? And so you look through your memory, and you find this previous object token, and now you have to decide whether they represent the same entity, the same person. And starting from infancy, we do this by saying, okay, well, this person I see now looks like the person that I saw back then, so they're the same person. But at about 4 years old, we start to do something much more sophisticated, which is to say, well, I saw the person outside of this meeting, and they're outside of this meeting now, and people who go to meetings tend to stay at meetings, and it's very unlikely that my cousin, who looks sort of like this person, arrived at the meeting from Europe. So I'm gonna construct this history that says that the person that I saw yesterday must have stayed at the meeting, and I'm seeing them again here at the meeting. But of course, this history you've constructed is complete confabulation. You weren't watching. You have no idea what actually happened. You don't know what they did in the last 24 hours, but you made something up. So our memories that just identify objects are largely confabulation because we have these snapshots of objects, but we connect them across time to establish identity. Well, we do that in particular for us. We're not paying attention to ourselves all the time. We just have snapshots. So we confabulate histories for ourselves, just like we've confabulated histories for this and that and all of you and me. Well, what does this mean? I want to interpret it a little bit in terms of Hoffman's interface theory of perception, which most of you have probably heard about because he's talked about it on TED and at this meeting many times and at other places. But the basic idea is that our experience can be thought of as an interface, like the user interface of a computer, and perceptions come into it, and decisions go out of it, and we make actions in the world, and then we observe with perception some next state that we interpret as the effect of our action. But we actually don't have any more information about the world than our experience gives us. And that's straight from David Hume, in the 1700s, with just a little bit of added detail. So here's an example of an interface. This is part of an interface of a human cell. It's looking at the outside world through this membrane that's covered with proteins. And right behind that is this huge processing network that sends information to the cell to tell it what to do. And this is a really complex mess. And biologists spend their careers trying to figure this sort of stuff out. But here's an interface just laid out for you as it's known. We don't know nearly this much about the interfaces that our brains implement. But if you look at our internal perceptions, our perceptions of our thoughts, our emotions, our bodily sensations, our sense of what our bodies are doing, proprioceptive sensations and so forth, from the point of view of this interface theory of perception, then those are just experiences too. They're processed in exactly the same way as our experiences of the outside world. We have an affective perceptual map, which takes everything about our body also into our experience space. So what that suggests is that we actually don't know any more about our minds than we know about the world. Our minds are just as mysterious to us as the world is. And notice that I'm using the word mind here. I mean, of course, the brain's completely mysterious to us, but our minds are actually mysterious to us. We think we know that we're thinking. We think that we know that some ideas are really good ones and other ideas are not so well founded. But those epistemic sensations are just sensations, and we don't know what produced them. We don't know what the evidence for those sensations is. We don't really understand what's going in our minds at all. And I'll recommend a recent book that just came out this year by Nick Chater, who's a cognitive psychologist in Britain, that goes through the last 2 or 3 decades of experimental evidence for this very idea that we actually don't understand our minds at all. All we have is experience, just this flat interface on which stuff happens. And behind it is just the world, including the part of the world that is our bodies and our minds and all of the processing that our brains do, which is completely invisible to us. We don't experience it. So, I mean, you should ask about this what you should ask about every single thing any scientist ever says to you, which is, so what? you've told me all this cool stuff, so what? What do I actually have to do about it? And I just want to give you some thoughts from my own case about, so what? What does it mean to look at what physics tells us about the universe, or what psychology or neuroscience tell us about the mind? And one thing it tells us is that our knowledge is practical, but it's sort of silly and misleading to treat it as absolute. It tells us that we have to make assumptions about what's going on. We have to make assumptions about whether this clicker is the same clicker I picked up at the beginning of this talk. Those assumptions are really useful, but they're pragmatic. We make them only because they're useful. And if we think they're true, then we can get into deep trouble. But ontology, in the way that philosophers conceive of it, as a theory of what exists objectively in an observer-independent way in some universe that's outside of us, is sort of pointless. It's not something we can do. It's not really possible. It's not something that we have any basis for saying anything about. So ontology and metaphysics, science suggests to us, are things kind of to be avoided because they just get us into trouble. I think a very deep thing this tells us is that personal identity is a very fragile construct, and it's easy to lose. It's dangerously easy to become completely dissociated. And so we have to kind of guard this notion of identity that we've constructed for ourselves, while realizing that it's a construct, and that, if we drop it, it's easy to destroy. And finally, that our sense that we're in charge of our lives, which is deeply embedded, very deeply embedded in our intuitive structure, is very useful, but it's illusory. It's basically illusory. We're part of the universe, and we have no idea what the universe is doing. But a lot of what it's doing, or at least some of what it's doing, is what we experience ourselves doing. And to think that we're in control of that is really pretty crazy. So I just want to leave you with the idea that the conflict that science keeps revealing between our intuitions on the one hand and the counter-intuitions that we have, that we encounter as we're doing science. I mean, science is a process of generating intuitions and then seeing how they map out to perceptions. This conflict that science presents us with is not a problem. It's an opportunity. It's something to kind of revel in and enjoy. So I'll just suggest that you enjoy these contradictions that we're constantly faced with, as opposed to being worried about them. So thank you very much. Do we have questions or time for questions, or are we doing that later?
Okay.
It looks like one in the back.
All right. Wait. Let me bring the mic to you. Let me bring you the microphone.
I think what you're saying is in line with Gazzanaga's idea of the interpreter, that we do something, our body, our subconscious does something, and then after a while we look at what we did and we confabulate a story as to why we did it, and then we convince ourselves that that story is true. Is that?
Yeah, that's a very standard way of putting it, yeah.
Well, it's not me. I mean, that's Gazzanaga.
Right, yeah, Gazzanaga.
But it seems to me it's very
yes.
exactly in line with what you're saying.
Right, yeah. It's what's just come out of the last 30 years of work.
It's startling.
Yeah.